In the fourth quarter of 2007, Motorola lost $1.2 billion on phones in 3 months. The company that sold 130 million razr handsets had just been gutted by a single Apple keynote. Bankruptcy was inevitable, but Motorola refused to die. They split the company in two, sold the phone half to Google for $12.5 billion, and spent the next decade quietly buying America's public safety infrastructure. In May 2025, Motorola spent $4.4 billion acquiring Silvus, a defense radio firm embedded in U.S. Army programs. By 2026, the half Google had passed on was worth $70 billion. This is the story of how Motorola lost the phone war, killed its own identity, and built a defense empire nobody saw coming. To understand what Motorola lost, you need to understand what it once was. Motorola wasn't just a phone company. For 70 years, it was the company that defined what communication even meant. The first handheld radio Allied soldiers carried in World War II, Motorola. The radio Neil Armstrong used to transmit from the moon in 1969, Motorola.
I'm going to step off the limb. That's one small step for man.
The world's first commercial mobile phone call in 1973, placed by an engineer named Martin Cooper standing on a Manhattan street, Motorola. By 2004, that legacy peaked with the razr V3, the thinnest phone ever made, 130 million units sold, the best-selling clamshell in history. For 2 years, Motorola controlled the global conversation. Analysts called it a turnaround. Market share surged back toward 21%. But the razr had one fatal flaw. It was a hit product, not a platform. And in January 2007, a man in a black turtleneck was about to expose that flaw to the entire world. Inside Motorola's Schaumburg headquarters, engineers physically tore an iPhone apart on a workbench. What they found reassured them. The screen was fragile. The battery couldn't be replaced. There was no physical keyboard. It failed Motorola's drop test on the first try. The verdict was unanimous. This device was a niche product for Apple loyalists. It would never threaten a real phone company. They were right about the engineering. They were catastrophically wrong about everything else. Apple wasn't selling a phone. Apple was selling an ecosystem. The iPhone wasn't a device. It was a pocket computer that turned every app developer in the world into a Motorola competitor. By the time Motorola understood the shift, the floor had already collapsed beneath them. The numbers came in waves. Global handset market share dropped from 18.4% at the end of 2007 to 9.7% in 2008, then to 6% in 2009. The handset division lost $1.2 billion in a single quarter, while the rest of the company earned only $100 million. Motorola laid off 3,500 workers in January 2008, then 4,000 more in June. Then 120 of the 600 engineers at Motorola Labs. Motorola had spent its razr years winning on hardware volume and sacrificing margins. It had no software ecosystem, no app store, no developer community. Apple had redefined what a phone was. Motorola was still designing handsets in an era when the device no longer mattered. The phones that had defined Motorola for 30 years were now killing it. Greg Brown had been Motorola's CEO for less than a year when he made a decision that, on paper, looked like surrender. He was going to sell the part of the company that made Motorola famous and bet everything on the part nobody had heard of. The internal logic looked counterintuitive. The phone business, even bleeding, still generated headlines, brand recognition, and consumer demand. The other half, Motorola Solutions, made two-way radios for police departments and 911 dispatch software. Boring, slow-moving, unsexy. The kind of business Wall Street ignored. But Brown saw something nobody else did. Mission-critical communications, the kind used when a building is burning or an officer is in danger, could never be commoditized. These customers didn't buy on price. They bought on reliability, interoperability, and trust built over decades. Motorola Solutions had been supplying radios to American public safety agencies since the 1930s. Its P25 digital radio systems were embedded in thousands of police departments, fire stations, and emergency dispatch centers across the country. Switching vendors meant rewriting protocols, retraining personnel, and risking lives. Nobody switched. In March 2008, Brown announced the split. The consumer phone business would become Motorola Mobility. The enterprise division would become Motorola Solutions. The split closed on January 4, 2011. On paper, it looked like managed decline. Revenue at Motorola Solutions shrank to roughly $8 billion at the time of the split. Critics asked whether a business built on two-way radios had a future at all. But Brown wasn't managing decline. He was quietly building a monopoly in a market everyone else had already ignored. Meanwhile, Motorola Mobility went the other direction. Google acquired the handset business in May 2012 for $12.5 billion, driven mostly by Motorola's 17,000 patents, which Google needed to defend Android in court. By 2014, Google had written off most of the investment and sold Motorola Mobility to Lenovo for just $2.9 billion. The phone business that once made Motorola synonymous with mobile communications had been sold and resold for scraps. Motorola Solutions had quietly kept building. In March 2018, Brown made his second contrarian bet, a $1 billion acquisition that the financial press largely dismissed. He bought Avigilon, a Canadian video surveillance company. Wall Street couldn't see the logic. Why was a radio company buying cameras? Brown saw what they didn't. Every police department, fire station, and 911 center that already used Motorola's radios was about to need cameras, AI analytics, body cams, and access control systems. The radio was the entry point. Everything else was the upsell. Over the next 5 years, Brown ran the same play 4 more times. Indigo Vision for video software, Pelco for cameras, OpenPath for access control, each one filling a specific gap. By the time competitors realized what was happening, Motorola Solutions had deployed 5 million cameras across 300,000 sites. The company that once made phones was now the operating system for American public safety. The numbers told the story. Annual revenue climbed from $8 billion at the time of the 2011 split to $9.98 billion in 2023, then $10.82 billion in 2024, then $11.68 billion in 2025. Operating margins expanded to 29%. Total shareholder return since the spin-off exceeded 1,400%. But the biggest move was still ahead. In May 2025, Brown announced Motorola Solutions would acquire Silvus Technologies, a Los Angeles-based defense communications firm, for $4.4 billion, the company's second-largest acquisition ever. Silvus made something unglamorous and essential: mobile ad hoc network radios, or MANET devices, which allow soldiers, drones, autonomous vehicles, and law enforcement agents to communicate across secure, self-healing wireless networks that require no fixed infrastructure. The technology had been deployed in the U.S. Army's Integrated Visual Augmentation System and robotic combat vehicle programs. Its customers spanned military contractors, intelligence agencies, and federal law enforcement. Brown's logic was direct. Technology is the bedrock for protecting communities, securing borders, and defending against today's ever-evolving threats, whether in the air, on the ground, or in the water. Translation: Motorola was no longer just a public safety company. It was a defense platform. The deal closed in the third quarter of 2025. By the end of that fiscal year, Motorola Solutions carried a backlog of $14.6 billion, a record, meaning future revenue was already contractually locked in before a single new sale was made. The market cap reached approximately $70 billion by February 2026. In April 2026, Greg Brown was named Chief Executive Magazine CEO of the Year. The company that analysts had written off in 2008 as a failing phone maker had become one of the largest public safety and defense technology platforms in the Western world. The Motorola story contains 2 companies, the one that died and the one that didn't. The lesson is not about survival. It's about 3 decisions that separated them. First, sell the asset that's bleeding you before it takes the company with it. When Brown decided to spin off Motorola Mobility in 2008, the phone still felt like Motorola's identity. Every executive in the building had spent their career on phones. Selling them felt like amputation. But Brown moved before the bleeding became terminal. Google bought Mobility for $12.5 billion in 2012. 2 years later, Google sold it to Lenovo for $2.9 billion, a 77% loss. Brown had extracted maximum value at the moment of maximum leverage. Every year he waited would have cost more. Second, find the monopoly hiding inside your own company. Motorola Solutions didn't pivot to an unfamiliar market. It pivoted to a market it had quietly dominated since the 1930s, mission-critical communications for police, fire, and emergency services. Government customers in this segment don't switch vendors. They buy on reliability and trust built over decades. Compare this to HTC, once the world's most valuable smartphone maker, which had no protected niche to retreat into when the consumer market turned. By 2016, HTC was effectively dead. Motorola's escape hatch was something it had owned all along. Third, expand the moat before the competition notices. By the time rivals understood what Brown was building, Motorola Solutions had deployed 5 million cameras across 300,000 sites, embedded its radios in U.S. Army programs through Silvus, and locked in $14.6 billion of contracted backlog. Every police body cam, every 911 dispatch feed, every video analytics stream ran through Motorola infrastructure. The company didn't sell products anymore. It sold the operating system for public safety. Competitors would need a decade to replicate it. By then, the moat would already be wider. In 2008, Greg Brown took over a company losing $1.2 billion every quarter on phones nobody wanted to buy. By 2026, the half of Motorola that Google had passed on, that analysts had written off, was worth $70 billion, embedded in nearly every police force, fire department, and military program in the Western world. That gap between collapse and control is the entire lesson. The company you're famous for is not always the company that will survive. Sometimes the most valuable asset you own is the business nobody is writing about.